Hello and welcome to How Green Is Your Deal, a podcast about Europe's path to climate neutrality, the challenges it faces, and the ideas that guide it. I'm your host Jana Jöns, a climate policy researcher at Ghent University, and this podcast is part of the GreenDeal-NET network and the EU Climatic project. When we think about how climate policy is made in the European Union, we often picture these big climate and energy packages or things like the European Green Deal. But much of EU climate action happens actually in the technical details that guide the implementation of policies. In this episode, we're exploring two of these more technical measures, delegated and implementing acts. While these play an important role in ensuring efficiency in climate governance, they also raise important questions concerning accountability and transparency. To help us better understand how delegated and implemented acts shape EU climate policy behind the scenes, we are joined today by two guests. First, we have Brendan Moore, a researcher at the Brussels School of Governance, focusing on EU climate governance. And secondly, I don't think I have to introduce this guest anymore. You know him from previous episodes on trends in EU climate governance, Rosamond from Ghent University. Thank you so much for being here and welcome to the podcast.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Yeah, great to have you on. So maybe first to start, as I mentioned, we will be focusing on delegated and implementing acts today. What actually are they?
So as you mentioned in your introduction, delegated and implementing acts are something that is not widely known about the public. They're sort of a hidden component of the EU's climate program, but they are a huge component of the EU's climate program. We really need to understand these in order to understand what the EU is up to in the realm of climate governance. So basically, delegated acts make minor technical amendments to a piece of basic legislation. So they're attached to a piece of basic legislation like the emissions trading system, effort sharing, energy efficiency, renewable energy, all that good stuff that we all know about. And they're designed to make really small technical amendments to that piece of basic legislation over time. Implementing acts, on the other hand, again, are attached to a piece of basic legislation, but are designed to give implementing instructions to the member states. Now, what's really important about these two technical pieces of EU policymaking is that they are done in a way that sort of sidelines some of the legislative actors. So for implementing acts, for example, there's no role for the European Parliament. So the Commission sort of takes the mandate on itself to propose these implementing acts, and then it goes through a comitology system where member states have expert committees that sort of make these decisions. Delegated acts, on the other hand, so to make minor technical amendments to the pieces of legislation, the Council and the Parliament can object to these, but they have no authority to actually legislate on them. So basically, these things can be done very quickly. Implementing acts can pass in a matter of days to weeks, and delegated acts can pass in a matter of weeks to months by sidelining the role, especially of the European Parliament. So they're not supposed to be big political decisions, but rather really small technical updates to pieces of basic legislation.
Yeah.
No, go ahead.
No, I was just going to add on to what Jeff was saying. I think most of the time, these are they're not very salient to the public, or really, actually, we were talking really to policymakers sometimes, or even in researchers. They're quite low level, and they often, for example, don't have much public feedback. The Parliament and the Council can, for example, object, but often they don't. Mm-hmm. So often when these things go through the policy process, they don't get a lot of attention, or at least not as much attention as other pieces of legislation. So basically they can play an important role, but they're often really just don't have very many eyes on them as the process goes forward.
Mm-hmm. They're a bit hidden because of their more technical nature, and then I suppose the main involvement of the European Commission and not much of these other institutions, even though in the delegated acts maybe a little bit more, but not in a very active role in the policy process. So as you mentioned, there are some benefits to using them, right, in terms of speed and everything. And you mentioned some uses in EU climate governance where they play a role. Can you expand a little bit more on these, knowing that you have made this sort of database of implementing and delegated acts?
Yeah. So just to talk a little bit about the research we did, what we tried to do is we looked at the implementing and delegated acts for climate and energy for the von der Leyen commissions up to 2025. So I think that was about 300 pieces of legislation altogether. I think in general, most of them kind of follow this pattern that Jeff was talking about. They're quite short term. They get agreed to quite quickly. There's really not much focus on them often. For example, they only a certain percentage have public feedback periods, but a lot of times they really only get a couple actual pieces of feedback, so that they're open for feedback, but actually they don't get that much of attention. Now, there are some exceptions. There was the so-called sustainable taxonomy, and this was basically making a list of technologies that are considered either sustainable or transitional toward sustainability. And that got a lot of attention. So for example, that Delegated Act got about 47,000 comments. So you have exceptions, and actually I think these are very important when we're talking about accountability and democracy, but for the most part, they do follow this kind of short-term, relatively little attention, and relatively quicker than the legislation which they come from, basically.
Absolutely. I think if done appropriately, delegated and implementing acts are a crucially important part of the EU's climate program. We need them. They get a lot accomplished in short 5-year political cycles, and they take a lot of pressure off of the committees in the European Parliament and the working groups in the Council, right, which are really busy with all of the work that they're doing on the OLP files, on the basic legislation. So really, we need this expert opinion that's being done by the Commission and in the comitology system to get this done quickly. We just need to make sure that it's not overstepping its purpose. So as long as this stays in technical amendments in keeping the basic legislation fit for purpose, so things like the emissions trading system, right? Just this beast of a policy that is very technically complex and needs a lot of experts working on it, it's really important that we have this. But when we run into problems is when political decisions are being made by these acts. And that's when we need deliberative fora like the European Parliament to dig in. So when things get political, that's when we need to say, okay, maybe this is not something that should be done through an expedited procedure, but rather needs some more layers of representative democracy taking a look at it.
Because that's, I guess, a bit of the trade-off that then is happening with these acts, right? You mentioned they're hidden, or the involvement of different actors is a bit lower, maybe not as much public participation. That then gets a bit complicated if they're being used like too many times. Is that something that you then saw that is happening more often in EU climate governance? Or is that difficult to say at this point?
Well, I mean, I think one important point is that the acts that we're looking at really come very concentrated from a few pieces of legislation often, or at least that's where a lot of them come from. So, for example, with the implementing acts, if I remember correctly, 60% come from the Emissions Trading Directive, the Renewable Energy Directive, and the Fluorinated Gases Regulation. So just those three pieces of underlying legislation are the ones that then call for these implementing acts. I think because of that, in these cases, like from the time of the von der Leyen Commission, I think you have seen a big increase in their use from when they were first introduced. Now, it's important to note that before these were created under the Lisbon Treaty, there were other types of acts, but these specific types of acts have increased quite a lot in recent years.
Yeah, but then maybe also tied to these specific pieces of legislation. I guess there was a lot of new legislation or updated legislation in the von der Leyen One Commission, right, with the European Green Deal and everything, that then also leads to more of these type of acts coming out. At the same time, like, we're sort of in this context of, I guess, democratic backsliding, as we've talked a little bit about in this podcast already. Specifically, I think it's episode 25 with Diarmaid. So please listen to that one as well if you haven't. Where we see that there's sort of like this wider trend in the EU that sort of sidelines more of this public participation or more of these democratic procedures, and these omnibus procedures and all of this, simplification, everything going on. How do you think sort of like this trend towards using these implementing and delegated acts fits in sort of this wider context of EU climate policy making? Difficult question.
No, yeah. I mean, I would say that a lot of them, I think, are basically fine. I think a lot of them are very technical or very simple. So, for example, I said about the implementing acts, most of those come from the Renewable Energy Directive. If you actually look at those acts, a lot of them are basically the Commission approving specific voluntary schemes related to renewable energy. I don't think there's as much of a democratic or accountability issue with that, because honestly, when you look at those specific acts, it kind of fits what we talk about when we say kind of short technical policymaking. I think somewhere where you might hit a few challenges is when it becomes more political. So we were talking about the taxonomy. I think that had a lot of comments. There was a lot of politics involved. And the key issue was, were nuclear energy and natural gas, should those be considered as one part of the taxonomy, as transitional technologies? And I think the issue there, I think, potentially for democratic accountability, is that in a lot of ways you had a process that was a lot like a normal legislative procedure. You had a lot of engagement from stakeholders. You had a process actually, and I looked at this right before to check, we talk about them being faster, but in that specific case, it wasn't really faster. So the time it took to create the underlying legislation was about the same as the delegated legislation. So I think you get into these issues with something like the taxonomy, where you have discussions that you can make a pretty strong argument that these should be being had in a normal procedure with the European Parliament and the European Council playing their normal role as the legislators working off of a Commission proposal. And I think that's where I think you have a bit more of an issue, rather than these a lot of the other cases where it's actually quite simple and technical.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that part of the story here, and we're still trying to think through of, why is this rise of delegated and implementing acts happening and things like that. And of course, a big part of it is, as Brendan said, and you mentioned as well, it's just that the fact that the climate program itself is becoming more robust. So a lot of these are doing a job that they're supposed to be doing. But part of what we might be seeing also is this wider trend of sort of the crisification of public policy, right? And this also feeds into the competitiveness thing, like the competitiveness crisis and the need to make policy really quickly in order to address certain crises. And we have to remember something like the EU taxonomy was in part responding to an energy crisis, right? We need to get this done really fast. We need to expand our renewables, and we need to be thinking about energy sources that may be a backup in case renewables fail. So let's think, maybe is gas green? Is nuclear green? These really controversial statements that a lot of people disagree with was then passed through a delegated act. So part of the story could be this wider trend of crisification in the need to pass things really quickly. So to pass policy quickly in the name of an energy crisis, in the name of a competitiveness crisis, let's cut corners where we can. And that's where we're really seeing things like the omnibus package, right? There was no impact assessment done there. Or you could also look at the SAFE regulation in defense, where the council was the sole legislator. I'm not saying necessarily that delegated and implementing acts are part of this trend specifically, but it could be part of the story that we have to reflect on a little bit as social scientists.
Yeah, there could be like a danger in them, right? Like if they're used for what they are supposed to be used for, like these technical details and like guiding implementation, like fine. But then I guess the danger is when more political priorities also sort of gets introduced through like these delegated acts, where suddenly this technical, measure instrument becomes, I guess, a bit more political as well.
Yeah, like it doesn't seem like it's something that's been happening a lot, but because we've now seen it happen with this taxonomy, it's like, okay, the alarm bells have sort of been ringing a little bit. We have to watch it. We have to be careful and make sure that it doesn't become a regular normalization in EU policymaking.
And I think as well, another way to think about it is that it's also important to look at the broader universe of these acts. Because the good thing about the taxonomy, at least, there are these questions, but also in the universe of these delegated and implementing acts, it actually has a lot of attention, relatively speaking. So there's academic research on it. There was a lot of comments and these types of things. But you really also need to look at the rest of them, or the whole universe, to kind of look at these issues and research a little bit more. Is this important to look at other things that maybe haven't gotten as much attention, but they could actually be just as important, even though they haven't had as much attention.
Yeah, so it's important to look at, I guess, the entire context of also the piece of legislation that then this delegated or implementing act gets attached to, and then why, etc. But quite complicated. So thanks a lot for your service in looking at these delegated and implementing acts, because I know political scientists do not always devote that much attention to them. But a good reminder for us that we should, all of us should also look at them a bit more. So maybe as a final question, is there something that gives you like hope for the future in sort of these days, these turbulent days? Maybe.
Jeff, you can go first.
Well, I will say,
Find another thing to give you hope, Jeff.
What's giving me hope
What's
these
giving
days?
me
Let's
hope
see.
today?
What's happening today? Well, listen, I will say, it's promising that we are seeing a rise in delegated and implementing acts in one way, because, as we said, this does show that the climate change program itself is expanding. So we have a more complex Fit for 55 package than we've had with previous packages. We just have a lot of climate legislation that is guiding us towards decarbonization, towards that net zero goal at this point. So that's great. We have a lot of instruments working together to decarbonize our economy. And I also think another thing I was just thinking that's sort of giving me hope is how I think, and actually, Brendan, this ties a lot to the work that you're doing right now, is sort of looking at how much knowledge the EU is drawing on, how much scientific expertise at this point the EU is drawing on to develop not only these delegated and implementing acts, but also the basic legislation, right? So we now have this European Scientific Climate Advisory Board at the top. We have the comitology system for the implementing acts, which we should trust, right? These are experts. They're designed to sort of make these technical amendments that politicians don't have a lot of knowledge on. So it's good that they're doing this work, saving our politicians from digging into things that they really shouldn't be digging into. And as well, things like, the council working groups all have experts behind them as well. So there's really a lot of knowledge feeding into the system at this point, a lot more than in previous commissions. So I've been sort of hopeful that that trend will continue and that knowledge will continue to be taken seriously and used appropriately as we move forward with climate policymaking.
Yeah, and that's a good reminder as well of also the importance of trust and confidence in policymakers, that maybe if there is some sort of erosion of trust, that has all of these cascading effects as well. While you're right that there are so many experts that we can actually put our trust in as well. Brendan, do you have anything?
Well, just to jump off of what Jeff said, I think it is quite a hopeful sign that we have this big jump in climate and energy legislation around the European Green Deal, around Fit for 55. We're going to shortly have the new package on the 2040 target as well. So I think it's important to kind of step back a little bit and kind of be hopeful that so much is going on. And as we know, the European Green Deal it wasn't planned to happen that way. So I think we're quite lucky that it did happen and that we did have the increases in ambition that we had in the EGD that weren't necessarily foreseen beforehand. I also think, we've been talking about transparency. I will say one good thing, I think, is that when we were doing this research for these acts, there is a database online with the information that we use. So the fact that we didn't need to go into other sources and really build it ourselves was actually quite helpful. So I think it is an important point that now it is available on these online databases. You can go in and search for these acts in a much more systematic way, which makes it easier both from a research side, but I would assume also, for example, for advocacy in other groups.
Mm-hmm. The information is out there. You just know where to look and that it actually exists. Because I feel like that's also this thing with this delegated implementing acts. So hopefully this podcast can contribute to shedding some light on it as well and maybe inspire people working in different kinds of sectors to work a little bit more with them as well. Thanks so much for being here. It really was a pleasure.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
That's it for this episode. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe to How Green Is Your Deal on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you are listening. If you want to stay informed on GreenDeal-NET's activities, please go to greendealnet.eu and subscribe to the newsletter.